Good evening. And needless to say, I'm happy to be here. Having 3 weeks here with you is not an accident. It was done on purpose. And everything that I do is for my pleasure. And so it is that we are here for my pleasure. However, because we have so very few people ever from what we would call the public, those who come to our lectures are the very serious students who, for the most part, come to the classes. And even if they do not come to the classes, they are nevertheless just as serious in their studies. And so it is that this 3 weeks will be just as much classwork during the lectures as the class itself. I don't know where we could draw a line and say that one is a lecture and one is a class. Sometimes there are lectures, purely lectures, but that is where we are in cities where there are not many infinite way students, and a great many other students come from other movements or churches. But I do not think you're going to find our work here to be so much of the nature of lecture as classwork. And I would like it to be that way because it is very apparent that this will be the last work in Chicago for at least a year, if not more. And so we will have to do all that can be done in this brief time so that there is enough work left behind for everyone's study. In preparing for this work tonight, the subject that opened itself to me is perhaps one of the most vital in all of the spiritual way of life, because the subject itself is fundamental. The solution to the basic problem is likewise fundamental, but so little understood and so little experienced that it makes for somewhat of a difficulty in presenting it, and yet the necessity is present. Let me start by saying that to the spiritual individual, I mean by this the individual who lives by the Spirit, we may call him the Son of God, the real man. Freedom is his natural estate. And there is no way to confine spiritual being or an individual who has realized his spiritual nature and identity. On the other hand, slavery is the natural estate of the human being, and a human being can never escape slavery. A human being is destined to be in slavery throughout all of his days and never to know freedom from it. The only hope of the human being is to rise out of his humanhood, for there is no other way. This is a history of thousands of years, so that there is no possibility of saying we haven't seen the end yet. We have seen the end, and we know beyond all doubt that the nature of the human being is to be enslaved. Thomas Jefferson warned about this during the very years when political freedom and religious freedom was being established on this continent, and where he played such an important part in establishing it. Yet he was able to say that when freedom ends in this nation, it will not be because of any external enemies. It will be because of our internal enemies, our own people. And it is inevitable that civilizations will come and civilizations will go, and none will ever remain. No civilization of humankind will ever remain, because humanity contains within itself the seed of its own destruction, and that seed is ignorance. Now, when the Hebrews were in slavery to Pharaoh, of course, according to them, it was all Pharaoh's fault. He was the slave master, or the pharaohs were the slave masters. They held the Hebrews in bondage, in slavery. Of course, this never was true, because the people of the pharaohs were in as much slavery as the Hebrews were, only of a different nature of slavery. You can't imagine the slave masters, the guards. You can't imagine the people of Egypt as being any more free than the Hebrews, with the exception that they were not quite so much under the whip, but they were under the whip of their leaders and under the dominion of their leaders. And of course they too would have said that that is because they were only the people, and the pharaohs were the pharaohs, and it was natural for the people to be the slaves of their rulers. When Moses led the Hebrews out of slavery, it should have been evident then, not necessarily to those participating, they were too close to the scene, but certainly it should have been evident to future generations that it wasn't Pharaoh who kept the Hebrews in slavery. It was the Hebrews' ignorance of how to attain freedom, because when one individual came along, inspired with the understanding of how freedom is attained, and without taking up the sword against Pharaoh, freedom was given to the Hebrews, or experienced by them, at least as much freedom as their natures at that time could absorb and experience. However, it wasn't long before they themselves were masters and controlled slaves. And we have a long history of the Hebrews conquering other nations and taking the men and the women in slavery, and in turn being defeated and being brought themselves under imprisonment and slavery by the neighboring nations who were momentarily stronger. And so we come through all of ancient history finding that life is one experience of slavery after another, all the way up to the time of Rome. Now, of course, the Caesars supplant the Pharaohs, and so the Caesars become the heads of state, the slave owners, and not only of the Hebrews, less perhaps of the Hebrews, or rather the Hebrews had perhaps more freedom under the Caesars than many other peoples of other nations that came under the sway of Rome. And so it is that we find that slavery, whether under Pharaoh or whether under Caesar, is slavery, and we find that the way out of slavery is again to be found by an individual who teaches that there is another kingdom, that there is another realm, and attaining that kingdom, attaining that realm, frees one, sets one free from the limitations of slavery. From that day on, we have the history of the peoples of Europe in slavery to the church, when they weren't in slavery to kings and emperors, and queens, and czars. In this land, we had the slavery of the Negro under the whites, and all the way to the present day, when the Negro is a slave in South Africa, and only recently gaining freedom in Central Africa and Northern Africa, but still as much enslaved in South Africa as ever the Hebrews were under Pharaoh or under other nations under Caesar. The condition of slavery hasn't changed. It is only the people and the races who have changed, who are momentarily in slavery or the enslavers. But then this is only one form of slavery. Let us call this political slavery. There always has been religious slavery. Throughout all time, people have been in subjection to churches of one nature or another, and sometimes their slavery is noted in the uniforms they wear, so that none may have individuality, none may have the dignity of an individual. All must be clothed in one uniform, so that each one may be lost in the herd, in the masses. You have this form of slavery, political, religious, but these are only two forms. And let us not forget this, both of these forms of slavery are not brought about by the people external to the slaves, but by the ignorance of the slaves to know how to bring about their freedom and how to maintain it. But there are other forms of slavery. In our day, we have the wage slave. Think of an individual living imprisoned in a salary, and not knowing how to escape from that slavery, never knowing the freedom of spending, never knowing the freedom of having, enjoying, always having to live within the confines of that slavery and plan and plot and scheme in order to be able to live within the boundaries of a wage that in most cases is always insufficient to maintain the dignity of man, the individuality which is his birthright. And we have the self-imposed slavery of our social security system. We have so many forms of slavery under which we live in ignorance of the fact that such slavery is self-imposed because of ignorance. It isn't normal or natural to live in a world that is filled from end to end with rich treasures in the ground. Minerals, vegetables, animals, jewels, gems, gold and silver, and all of the other rich treasures of the earth and of the sky, and yet be in limitation. It isn't natural. It isn't normal. It isn't our birthright. The dignity of the individual demands freedom. Freedom from political domination, religious domination, wage domination. From every form of domination up to the final one that enslaves all mankind, and that is the body. Even those who have achieved a measure of freedom from all these other forms of slavery finally must acknowledge that they are slaves of the body, and they live within its confines, and the body is a taskmaster. The body tells us when it is healthy or when it is sick. It tells us how much walking we can do or how much running. It tells us how many hours a day we can work. We seem to have no control over the body. It has a control over us, and we obey its mandates, and we are in limitation to its demands. And this is not natural, and this is not normal, and this is not the birthright of man. This is only the imposed condition of mankind, of the human race. The human race that lives in ignorance of the principle that will make it free. The Master rightly taught that we shall not take up the sword, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword. He rightly taught, resist not evil. And yet he taught the necessity for freedom. He taught the right to attain freedom, and he taught the method whereby freedom is attained, and all without taking up the sword, all without staging a human revolution, all without even coming out into the open to declare one's freedom. As a matter of fact, he taught also the nature of secrecy and the need for secrecy. And he showed us that the way to our freedom is through prayer, and that the prayer must be conducted in secrecy, and that the Father that seeth in secret rewardeth us openly. The question that must come to the mind of every individual is, how is it taught that we are to attain and maintain our freedom? If one civilization after another has found freedom and lost it, and if it is true, as some of our highest officials are warning us now, that we in this country are dangerously close to the time when we will lose our civic liberties again. We are being openly warned of it, and that the time is not far off that our own sloth, our own indifference, our own desire to live under governmental handouts is bringing us once more into political slavery. The question must come again, how this time are we to attain our freedom, and possibly this time maintain it and sustain it? Because if we are to follow, as we try to in this message, the message and mission of the Master, we are not thinking in terms of staging another revolution against our government. We are not thinking in terms of overthrowing the government. We have witnessed the Tsar overthrown for freedom's sake, and the people sold into a greater degree of slavery than they ever knew under the Tsars. We have witnessed the overthrow of the Kaiser, who supposedly was anti-Christ and anti-democracy, only to witness the rise of Hitler and a greater form of slavery than Germany ever in its history knew. Therefore, there is no one who can be so brave and so bold as to say, it cannot happen here, or it cannot happen to me. There is no such thing, because history is just a series of repetitious experiences, always the same, because the human race does not have the faculty of learning by past experience. The human race must learn by trial and error. The human race must make the same mistakes as its ancestors. You can witness this in your own children and your own grandchildren. You know as well as I do that you could save your children and your grandchildren just about 90% of all of the troubles that they're going to get into, if only they would listen to you and to the experience that you have had in your lifetime, but you already know that they won't, and therefore you know that they are going to have the same troubles you had. And so are their children going to have the same troubles, and all the other children down through the ages, because there is no provision in the human mind for benefiting by the experience of others. Whether or not we are concerned with political slavery, religious slavery, economic slavery, or the slavery of the body, at this moment it really makes no difference. Everyone will have to admit, if they're honest, that they are at this moment in some form of slavery, in some form of limitation, that in some way their life is not being lived in complete freedom. I don't particularly like to mention this, that marriage itself has become a form of slavery to most of the people. Few in married life have the freedom that they hope to find in marriage, and the lack of freedom comes not only in the relationship itself, in the demands that are made upon the married people economically, and with the care of the children, with the care of elders, and with all of the other distresses that come into the married estate and prevent individuals from experiencing the freedom that marriage should mean. The freedom that marriage can't mean while there are these limiting experiences. So whether or not it is one form or another of slavery, or if you are one of the few fortunate ones who are experiencing no sense of limitation in any direction and have your complete freedom, if it isn't founded on a spiritual experience, then remember it can happen also to you. So we are concerned tonight with that which we may call slavery, if we want to use a broad term, or limitation, if we want to use another. Limitation, there is a word we all understand. Limitation of freedom, limitation of expression, limitation in supply, limitation in movement, limitation in some form. And then the answer comes, what is the remedy? And the answer is, the remedy is that which was taught us not only when Moses freed the Hebrews, but when the Master brought the greatest degree of religious and political freedom to his followers that had been known up to that time. Freedom comes through enlightenment. It does not come by fighting error. It does not come by overpowering evil, nor does it come by appealing to some unknown God to come down out of the sky and rescue us from our vile prisoners. Freedom does not come from an appeal to a God. Freedom does not come through warfare of any name or nature. Freedom comes through enlightenment. Enlightenment comes through opening one's self, one's consciousness, to that which cannot be seen, heard, tasted, touched, or smelled, a power invisible, and a power that does not war with other powers, but dissolves everything that appears in the nature of enmity or enemy, whether without our being or within. But primarily, its victory is over ourselves, because it is we ourselves who are our enemies. It is we ourselves who hold ourselves in bondage to ignorance. It is we, through the indulgence of our normal human natures, that hold ourselves in bondage, like the man in debt, the man who is complaining about his creditors, the man who is complaining about all of the reasons why he is in debt, and never acknowledges that the reason is because he doesn't live within his income. The reason is that he doesn't measure his outgo by his income but always can find reasons and excuses why the outgo must be greater than the income. And with the exception of a few rare cases where the degree of ignorance has brought about uncontrollable circumstances, we know that this isn't true. We only have to look at the records of the time sellers to know to what extent the public is living beyond its means, not because of necessity, but because of the nature of the human to go beyond himself and his capabilities and bring upon himself these discords. Certainly it is in this very month that we have been reading of the abuses of these credit cards, the terrific losses that are being sustained by the companies that have so freely mailed to everybody 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 different credit cards, leaving it up to the individual's integrity not to spend more than he can afford. Foolishness. He has the integrity, he just hasn't the will to stop spending while somebody will take his signature. Not everyone. I'm not speaking of everyone. But I am speaking of those who are in bondage to that particular form of slavery or limitation, not by reason of any external slave master, but by virtue of his own enemy, himself. In opening ourselves to enlightenment, we find that there is a power and a presence. In Christian mysticism, this is called the Christ. But since there is no such thing as a localized mysticism, since mysticism is a universal state, it is termed the Buddha or Buddhi in India, and it is termed Satori in Japan. It has many names because the state of Christhood is a universal state, and it merely has different names according to the language you are using. The Hebrews have the same Christ, only its name is Messiah. Its name is Emmanuel. But whether you call it Emmanuel or Messiah, or whether you call it Christ or Buddhi or Satori, it is the same thing. It is an invisible presence and power that exists within everyone, and it is called the Son of God, or it is called the real self, or the divine self. But it exists closer to you than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. Even as the Master taught, its kingdom is neither low here nor low there. You don't have to go to holy mountains to find it, or worship in holy temples in Jerusalem, for its kingdom is within you. Its abode is within you. First of all, enlightenment consists of knowing this first truth, that there is a divine presence and power equally present in every individual, regardless of his nation, color, race, creed, religion, regardless of whether he lives in freedom or slavery, regardless of whether he is in prison or out, whether he is in hospital or out. There is this potential, this spiritual impulse, which the Master came to reveal. Certainly the Master revealed it. He revealed a kingdom within you, a presence, a power, which would set you free. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Not the sword, not revolution, and not rebellion, and not fighting against people, governments, or outside prison keepers, but quietly, gently realizing, first of all, that the element of slavery, of limitation, is within me, within my own ignorance of true being, and that the remedy is also within me. Therefore, this battle must be fought, if a battle it is to be, is within me. It is to be fought within me, not outside, and I am not to fight other people, not even my wife or my husband. The battle is within me, and it is a battle of light over darkness, illumination over ignorance, and it begins with this recognition. I need not take up the sword. I need not fight persons, conditions, or circumstances. I can, as of this moment, relax in the realization of this. The overcoming is to take place within me, so that eventually I may say with the Master, I have overcome the world. And the Master did it without a sword, and he did it without fighting anyone. He did it merely by revealing that ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. But the truth also will keep you free. And regardless of 1,000 who may fall at your left or 10,000 at your right, regardless of the political or economic conditions that may exist abroad in the world, it will not come nigh thy dwelling place. For if you abide in the Word, and if you let the Word abide in you, you will bear fruit richly, while those who do not abide in the Word or let the Word abide in them, they will be as a branch of a tree that is cut off and withereth. Now, let this point be clear. On the human plane of life, you live under the law. In ancient days it was called the law of Moses. But the Master came to supplant that law so that we may live under grace. What is this law under which the human race lives? It is the law of cause and effect. In India it is called karma. In Christianity it is called, as ye sow, so shall ye reap. If you sow to the flesh, you will reap corruption. If you sow to the Spirit, you will reap life everlasting. And always the message of the Master comes back to the word you. It is always you who are responsible. It is always you who are either sowing to the flesh and reaping corruption, or it is you who may sow to the Spirit and reap life everlasting. It is always you who are reaping in accord with your sowing, and therefore the Master does not blame anyone else for our troubles. The Master always puts it squarely up to ye. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. He doesn't even say the truth will make you free. It is your knowing of the truth that enables the truth to make you free. Therefore, it is always you again. Now, if you acknowledge this, you have taken the second step. In the first step, you acknowledge that there is a presence and a power within you capable of bringing you your freedom and maintaining it and sustaining it for you. And in the second step, you are acknowledging that any form of limitation that exists in your experience, any form of slavery, whether to food, to drugs, to alcohol, whether to limitation in any form, the reason for it exists within you in the form of ignorance. Don't look for it in any other form. Don't get metaphysical and believe it's because you're jealous or envious or lustful, or because it's because you aren't grateful or you don't love your mother-in-law. All of these things have nothing to do with your slavery. Only one thing has to do, and that is ignorance. And the ignorance is always an ignorance of truth, for it is the truth that will make you free. Truth will free you from the limitations even of the body, so that in a great measure you can live as having dominion over your body. We do not seem to accomplish that in the fullness and completeness of it at this particular time, but then you must remember that we are making a lot of concessions to the world. We are not taking ourselves off to live in caves or monasteries or convents and thereby freeing ourselves from the universal influences. And therefore, to some degree, all of us are experiencing some form of limitation. But let that not concern us, because if we can demonstrate 80 to 90% of freedom from those things that are bothering the world, we will have attained a high measure of life while tabernacling here on earth. Acknowledging then that our ignorance of truth is holding us in bondage to the body and its ills, or to economic limitation, or political limitation. For remember, it is just as easy to be free under a slave form of government as it is under a republic or democracy, just as it is as easy to be in slavery under a free form of government as otherwise. Many have experienced this. History shows us the lives of so many who have lived in times of slavery and yet been free. Now, our next step is then a willingness to withdraw condemnation from the external world. Our willingness to acknowledge that as we overcome spiritual ignorance within ourselves and attain a measure of spiritual light, in that direct proportion will freedom come into our experience. We may only experience a freedom in an infinitesimal degree tomorrow or the day after, but you will find that progress is gradual but certain, and that as time passes on and we remain true to the spiritual principles which we learn and apply, that our freedom comes in greater and greater measure. Now, the measure of your freedom will come with the degree in which you find an answering response within you to what has come through to you. In other words, if within you there is some response, some agreement that there is a potential of freedom within me, and there is a measure of darkness, of spiritual ignorance within me, which must be overcome, and if it appears possible to you that your troubles are not your troubles because of someone or circumstance external to you, but rather through this inner ignorance, then you may be assured of this: you are opening the way for your own freedom to begin to appear. If, however, there is a mental wall going up within you, either of resistance to what has been said or of denial of it, then you must seek further for the truth that will make you free, for this isn't it at this particular time. When the Master says, "My sheep hear my voice," he means exactly that only those that are of my own household will hear my word. He said that again, that he was sent only to those of his own household. That was interpreted to mean then that he was sent only to the Hebrew people. But of course, we know better than that, because the Hebrew people accept his teachings probably less than most others. And so it wasn't that he was sent to the Hebrew people necessarily. He was sent to those who could receive and respond to his message of spiritual freedom. As a matter of fact, it was some of his own disciples that refused this very spiritual freedom to others and tried to limit it only to the Hebrews. And of course, their names are not written in heaven, as are the names of those who insisted on going to Europe and carrying the word to the Gentiles and to the stranger outside the gate. Their names have come down to us in our religious history. Therefore, this message is not to the people of any particular color, race, or religion, nor is it to the people of any particular metaphysical group or movement. This message is to those who feel its rightness, those who feel its warmth, those who feel its possibilities, and who wish to open themselves to it. And to all such, this message is open, even as the Christ message has always been open, whether it was presented in the form of Christianity or Zen or Tao or Western mysticism. Always the Christ message is open to those receptive and responsive. Now then, I would like to give you the first work necessary to establish freedom within our consciousness. Don't think of this now as establishing freedom outside of you. As a matter of fact, regardless of how far you go with me on the path, do not ever expect to exercise a freedom external to yourself. For the Christ, that which overcometh, is an overcomer of yourself and myself. And it establishes freedom within our consciousness. And the freedom established in our consciousness becomes externalized by power of the truth. Remember, I said to you at the beginning, we are starting a class right here tonight. And so I'm going to call your attention to a writing. It is a chapter entitled Protective Work in the book Infinite Way Letters, 1955. And I give you that for daily morning study. The reason is this. The first ignorance that enslaves us is the belief that when we arise in the morning, that anything can happen to us throughout the day. It might be something good, it could be something bad, most likely will be something neither good nor bad, but in between, and whatever it is, it will happen to us, and we have no control over it. And now let me reverse that for you. You have been given dominion over the day, as well as over the night. God gave you dominion over everything on earth, and in the air above the earth, and the skies above the earth, and in the waters beneath the earth, but mankind, humankind, has surrendered that dominion. Now you consciously resume it. And you do it by, again, spiritual enlightenment, going back to Genesis and acknowledging that as God gave the light of the day and the dark of the night, so he gave us jurisdiction over the day and over the night, and therefore this Son of God, which is planted within me, that which we term the Christ, by virtue of the Christ within me, I have dominion. In other words, with Paul, I can do all things through Christ. And therefore, by waking in the morning and acknowledging the presence and power of the Christ within me, and restoring to it God-given dominion over everything that transpires during the day, I am nullifying the law of cause and effect, and I am placing myself under the divine grace of the Christ within. My goal is that when I am through with my studies and my practice, that I will be able to say with Paul, I live, yet not I. Christ liveth my life. But I cannot hope to that attainment if I do not take the first step. And that step must be taken on waking in the morning. And it must be the realization that I am not governed by events of the day, nor am I governed by people of the day, nor circumstances or conditions. I am governed by the presence of the Christ within me. And I acknowledge here and now dominion over this day and its events, not by virtue of my egotistic self, but by virtue of the Christ that dwelleth in me, the Son of God, which was given dominion. Therefore, I shall not live in the ignorance of a human. I shall live by the divine grace
of the Christ. And if I am a Hebrew, I may call it the Messiah or Emmanuel. And if I am a Christian, I may call it the Christ. And if I'm a Buddhist, I may call it the Buddha or the Buddha mind. And if I happen to be a Zen student, I may call it Satori, but by whatever name I call it, I am referring to the Son of God in me, which was given dominion over the day and over the night, and all of the events that transpire therein. And so, in my human ignorance, I believed that I was subject to people. If I was a corporal, there was a sergeant over me. And if I was a 4-star general, there was a 5-star general. And God helped the 5-star general because there was a commander-in-chief over him. And none of us is any more than the one immediately above us. And we are only bosses of those in ignorance of their true identity. And therefore, let us realize this, that in our humanhood, we can never rise to any height, to any position, to any estate that will give us freedom or dominion, for always there will be one with a whip over us, the whip of authority. And the whip of authority can never be broken except by the Christ. And then, when we are in subjection to the Christ, we are under divine authority, which is the authority of a government not by the sword or whip, but by love, by mutuality, by cooperation, joy, and equal prosperity. There is no equal prosperity in communism. There is no equal prosperity in capitalism. There is no equal freedom in communism or capitalism. There is only the freedom that we attain by virtue of the recognition of the Christ within us, and then learning to live not only in subjection to it, but in the realization of its dominion over the circumstances and conditions of life itself. For it was planted in the midst of us for that purpose. Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine, but until you acknowledge him in all thy ways, you will not come under his government. Until you recognize that the responsibility is on his shoulder, this very Christ, Emmanuel, within you. Now, when you start that in the morning, and those of you who possibly can work with this in connection with that very chapter in the Infinite Way, Letters 1955, because in this you will gain the realization that this Christ is not a power that is going to slay your enemies. It is not a power that is going to destroy sin, disease, or death, or poverty. This is a power which establishes you in the realization of no contending power, no other power than that which is already within you. Class number 1. Thank you.